All right, so Palantir's third quarter earnings report came out this morning, and almost immediately afterwards, the stock price tumbled around 10%. Now in this video, I'm going to quickly run through some of the highlights of the Q3 report, including some of the positive and negative aspects of it. Then I'm going to talk about the price action and why the stock tumbled around 10%. And finally, I'm going to discuss what my plans are moving forward for my Palantir investment, including whether or not I'm still bullish on Palantir in the long term. So diving right into the news release from this morning, this is the high-level overview with some of the key points that Palantir's investor relations folks want to highlight. Now, it's important to keep in mind that they always try to put a very positive spin on this. So the main points that they're trying to raise are that they expect a 40% revenue growth in fiscal year 2021. So that's including next quarter, Q4 as well. And also that in the most recent quarter, they had a 103% year-over-year growth in the commercial side of the business. Now, both of these points are definitely positive. And in fact, overall, I would say that the Q3 earnings report is pretty solid, although there are definitely a few negative points that I'm going to discuss, some of which are definitely contributing to the fact that the price of Palantir has been trading pretty low starting at the opening of the markets this morning. First of all, if Palantir can hit that 40% revenue growth for this year, then that actually outpaces what they had projected, which was around 30%, so that's definitely a plus. And secondly, with the commercial revenue increasing 103%, that is definitely a huge benefit to the business. Now, the thing that they're not mentioning here and that you won't find in the report is whether or not relative to the government side of the business, commercial revenue is increasing, because a 103% increase in commercial revenue, of course, is great, because this time last year, they were really just starting to ramp up their commercial business. So you would expect to see pretty significant growth over their first year of really having a marketing and a sales team going out and trying to acquire new commercial clients. However, if that side of the business is not scaling, at least on par with, if not faster than the government side of the business, then that could be a negative point moving forward. And I think that's partially what some investors are reacting to this morning, but I'll get into that a little bit more further on down. So let me bring you over to the full earnings report here, which has a little bit more detail than the high-level news release. And as a quick aside here, I will say that Palantir, as a data analytics and data visualization company, does a really great job with these reports in terms of how they look. But anyways, I digress. So if I scroll down here, we can see some of these stats. For instance, the Q3 revenue grew by 36% year over year. And just so that we're on the same page, year over year in this case is comparing Q3 of 2020 to Q3 of this year. But quarter over quarter, i.e. Q2 to Q3 this year, revenue actually only increased by 4.4%, which is not really that much. In terms of some of the new business that Palantir added this quarter, they had 34 net new customers. And with that, we're talking about 54 deals worth at least 1 million, 33 of which were worth at least 5 million, and 18 of which were worth at least $10 million. Free cash flow is also improving year over year. And if we go back to the high-level summary here, they've got this great little chart that provides some of the highlights of the financials of the company. Now, here's something that I want to highlight is, in addition to the revenue growth, the loss from operations and net loss, which was $91 million and $102 million respectively, because something that I really want to see for Palantir moving forward is that the revenue growth outstrips the expenses of the company, so that we're seeing a divergence between how much it's costing them to go out and acquire new business. And if we compare the loss from operations and the net loss from Q3 of this year to Q2, you can see that in Q2 it was higher on both counts, 146 million for the loss from operations and 138 million for the net loss. So this means that quarter over quarter we're seeing some marginal improvements on that front. And what I would like to see is for the revenue to continue to scale much faster than the expenses. In terms of some of the more negative points from this earnings report, first of all, we've got the operating margin, which from the first 3 quarters of this year is at around 22%. And in fact, analysts, or some analysts, had expected that to be a couple of points higher. So in their view, then that was an earnings miss. Secondly, the fact that Palantir continues to add a lot of business in the government sector, including with the US Special Forces and the US Army, and also the fact that they're not now disclosing the percentage of their total revenue that's coming from both the commercial and the government side of the business, has some analysts worried that it's much too government centric and that it's overvalued in that sense, because the government side of things is obviously much less than the overall commercial business globally. So if they're going to focus more on the government side of things, then that means that potentially Palantir is not going to be as scalable as some people hoped that it would be. And while Palantir signed more net new customers this quarter than in Q2, they signed fewer deals, and a quarter-over-quarter growth in earnings of just 4.4% is not really something to get excited about. That said, this technically was an earnings beat because the $392 million that Palantir brought in Q3 exceeded the projected $385 million, and for the adjusted earnings per share, they met exactly what analysts expected at 4 cents per share. So realistically, Palantir had a pretty decent quarter. They exceeded their targets and continue to grow pretty much in line with what was expected. So what's the deal with the price action and the stock price dropping almost 10% immediately upon market open? What I attribute this mini crash to is that investors actually had very high short-term expectations for the stock. In fact, much higher than what was actually projected. And there's actually a lot of hype around this stock. So the fact that Palantir is just growing at around the rate that was officially projected means that in the eyes of some investors, it's actually an earnings miss because they were hoping for exponential growth. Also, this stock in particular seems to have a lot of skittish investors. Whenever there's big news one way or another, if it's earnings release or a new product being launched or anything like that, the stock price has pretty significant short-term price action. But am I worried about the future of this company and the future of my investment in it? The answer is no, not a bit. The fundamental underlying value proposition of the company and why I'm bullish on Palantir in the long term has not changed at all. In fact, Palantir actually made a lot of big moves this quarter that are going to be positive catalysts for the company in the future, but where they might not actually reap the rewards for quite some time. For starters, Palantir has been building out and ramping up its Foundry for Builders program, where they're going out and signing up new startups in new industries to get into the Palantir product, either with their sales team or using their SPAC acquisition vehicles. And this way, they're really expanding their reach and potentially growing their overall client base, expanding into new sectors. And I think that's going to actually reap some really interesting rewards down the line. Also, Palantir just launched Foundry for Crypto, which is another huge and very fast growing industry that they're getting into. And this one is particularly exciting because the use cases for Palantir software in the crypto sector are really potentially enormous. First of all, they could be working with exchanges on know your client and anti-fraud and anti-money laundering stuff. On the other hand, Palantir could also be working for governments using their AI software to do blockchain analysis, which at this point is pretty much impossible for human beings to do, at least at a scalable level. And with that blockchain analysis, we could see Palantir getting into even more parts of the crypto world because it's going to become ever and ever more important. And as the size and number of blockchains increases, you're going to need a smart, fast, efficient software like Palantir to be able to understand what's happening and to track transactions on the blockchain. So this really is a huge area of opportunity that is only just starting to be uncovered. So to wrap up, of course, I'm still holding my shares. I'm in this for the long term and I don't plan on selling any of it. If anything, if the price of the stock continues to drop into the low 20s, I may pick some more up and add to my position. When I'm watching short-term price action on a company like this that I'm very bullish on for the long term and where I think that the fundamental value proposition has still not even really been uncovered, or we're not even really scratching the surface of it, then really it's just another opportunity to increase my exposure to it in the short term, because in the long term, I think really the sky is the limit for this company and I'm still very bullish on what it can do in the coming years. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to see more content related to investing, personal finance, and starting a business, please don't forget to drop a like down below and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.